Her Royal Highness is the proud and happy mother of a prince. The salute is fired, and in the monarch's home lies the infant boy who will one day be king.
The royal family stands as a symbol of tradition, stability, and continuity. But behind the ceremony and public spectacle lies a world of rivalry, betrayal, and personal conflict. Because where power, love, and ambition collide, conflict is never far behind.
But I think it speaks to his sense of arrogance, that he really believed that his narrative was absolutely going to shut all of this down.
When Charles became king in 2022, he inherited an institution facing unprecedented scrutiny. But his first great challenge was not constitutional. It was personal, forcing the new monarch to make a choice between family and the future of the crown.
And frequently, I find that unless you have a disaster or a scandal, nobody ever knows what the hell's going on.
Born on the 14th of November 1948, Prince Charles entered the world as the first child of Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip. 4 years later, his mother's accession to the throne transformed him from a young prince into the heir apparent, ensuring that duty and destiny would define his childhood from the very beginning.
And so I think it's fair to say that both his parents were quite distant figures in the immediate aftermath of his growing up, and that he was close to his nanny, in fact, who he spoke his first words to than either of his parents, because they went off to Malta very shortly after he was born. And obviously you wouldn't take a young baby with you to Malta, but Prince Philip was serving out there. So there's a real sense, I think, from the outset that Prince Charles was always being treated in a certain way. I think this, if not estranged him from his parents, certainly gave him a very different kind of expectation to what it would be like for him to be a royal child.
When Prince Andrew was born on the 19th of February 1960, Prince Charles was already 12 years old. By then, Charles's future had long since been mapped out. As heir to the throne, his childhood was shaped by duty, expectation, and preparation. Much of his early life was spent adapting to the demands of a role he had never chosen, attending boarding school and gradually being introduced to public life as the future king.
Well, he was a very studious child. I mean, he was somebody who was quite unlike Prince Philip, who was a much more boisterous character. He was unlike his mother as well, his mother was somebody who was very serious from a very young age, and Charles, I think, inherited this seriousness, but what he had, which she didn't have, was a real interest in learning and a real interest in books and things like that. This is seen as quite anomalous, because members of the royal family are not traditionally seen as intellectuals, but Charles, I think, was seen as somebody who had intellectual ideas and interests, possibly inculcated in him from his nannies from a very young age.
Andrew entered a very different world. By 1960, Queen Elizabeth II had been on the throne for almost 8 years. The upheaval of the early reign had settled, and many royal historians have noted that she was able to devote more time to her younger children than she had to Charles and Princess Anne. Whether fairly or not, this gave rise to a long-standing perception that Andrew enjoyed a closer and more relaxed relationship with his mother. Among the many stories that have followed the royal family for decades, few have endured, quite like the belief that Prince Andrew was Queen Elizabeth II's favourite son. It is a claim that was never confirmed by the Queen herself. Like so much about her private life, she never spoke publicly about her relationships with her children. Yet the perception has persisted for generations, repeated by royal biographers, former palace staff, and those who observe the family at close quarters. Royal author Giles Brandreth has suggested that the Queen herself acknowledged feeling she had missed much of Charles's earliest childhood because of her royal duties. Other biographers have argued that this made her determined to be a more present mother to Andrew and Edward. Whether that translated into favouritism remains impossible to prove. What is beyond dispute is that Andrew appeared to share many of the Queen's personal interests. Like his mother, he developed a passion for horses, country pursuits, and military life. He often accompanied her at Balmoral and Windsor, and over the years they appeared together at countless private and public occasions with an ease that did not go unnoticed by royal observers. Prince Philip also found common ground with Andrew. Both men shared naval careers, a competitive spirit, and a directness of character that many commentators felt contrasted with Charles's quieter, more reflective personality. Some royal historians have argued that Andrew represented qualities Philip particularly admired, while Charles often found himself at odds with his father's expectations. Whatever the truth, one thing is clear. The Queen's presence often acted as a bridge between her two sons. As long as she remained on the throne, she had the authority, and perhaps the inclination, to keep private differences from becoming public divisions. The brothers' age difference meant they were never true childhood companions. By the time Andrew was taking his first steps, Charles was beginning life at Cheam School. When Andrew entered adolescence, Charles was serving in the Royal Navy. Their lives rarely overlapped, and their roles within the family quickly evolved along separate paths. As the eldest son, Charles was expected to embody the future of the monarchy. Increasingly thoughtful and introspective, he developed interests in architecture, the environment, and interfaith dialogue, often challenging convention and looking ahead to how the institution might evolve. Preparing to become king was not simply his destiny, it became the defining purpose of his life. Andrew's path was less constrained. Like his father before him, he pursued a career in the Royal Navy, qualifying as a helicopter pilot and serving with distinction during the Falklands War in 1982.
It's been a tradition in the royal family going back generations that when they're young, as young men, they typically serve in the armed forces, in the army, the navy, or the air force. We've seen that Charles did that. We've seen that Prince William has done that, and we've seen that Prince Andrew did that too.
And so in that sense, Andrew was doing what other royal sons had done. What was particularly notable in his case was that he actually saw active service. And I think that had an impact on him. He came home something of a hero.
It's the only time in their lives that they might have done what you or I might call a proper job. And it's possibly the only time in their lives that they've had the opportunity, at least amongst their fellow servicemen and women, to be treated like an ordinary individual. And for that reason, I think it's really important experience for them to have had.
I've been shocked at what has happened, the way that the ships were taken out. It is a really nasty. I mean, I think that a small missile, perhaps 18 feet long, can do that much damage. And I think we've all seen the photographs of HMS Sheffield and Atlantic Conveyor, or if not, I saw Atlantic Conveyor myself. She was a burning wreck. I mean, it was quite horrific. And on the other side, the pride of which to see how the British force actually worked together. And this was absolutely amazing. It really was.
His military service earned widespread public admiration and transformed him into one of the most popular members of the royal family. Confident, charismatic, and often described as the monarchy's action prince, Andrew appeared to relish a public role free from the constitutional burdens carried by his elder brother. To the public, the contrast between the brothers was striking. Charles was frequently portrayed as serious and dutiful, Andrew as energetic and self-assured. Yet there was little suggestion of animosity between them. They fulfilled different roles, appealed to different audiences, and occupied different places within both the family and the institution. Behind the scenes, however, royal biographers have long argued that these contrasting upbringings shaped the men they would become.
Being born into the royal family, especially if you're high in the line of succession, means that it's very difficult to plan for any future other than being a working royal. Buckingham Palace shares out the rota, as it were, and asks other members of the family to perform those royal visits because they get far more demands from all around the country than they're able themselves to fulfill.
Charles came to see monarchy as an institution that needed to adapt in order to survive. Andrew appeared more comfortable with the traditions, privileges, and certainties that had long defined royal life. These were not yet opposing visions, but the seeds of future disagreement had been quietly planted. For years, those differences mattered little. The Queen remained firmly in control, and the monarchy continued to function much as it always had. But as the brothers entered middle age, the institution they served and the expectations placed upon it began to change. And with it, so too did the relationship between Charles and Andrew.
I think it's hard to say that if Andrew was the direct heir, whether he would have behaved differently. I think certainly he had a more outgoing personality, he was more athletic, he was perhaps more good-looking than his elder brother. But it perhaps is also true that if he had his future mapped out and he was going to be king, there would have perhaps been a tighter focus and scrutiny of him.
Andrew, following his naval career and marriage to Sarah Ferguson in 1986, he became one of the monarchy's most high-profile figures. Even after their separation and eventual divorce, he remained a senior working royal, undertaking overseas engagements and, in 2001, accepting the role of the UK's Special Representative for International Trade and Investment. Charles, meanwhile, was steadily redefining the role of the Prince of Wales. Alongside carrying out hundreds of engagements each year, he established initiatives that reflected his own priorities and long-term vision for public service. In 1976, he founded the Prince's Trust, creating opportunities for disadvantaged young people through training, mentoring, and financial support. An organisation that would go on to help more than 1 million young people across the UK.
Really much more professional than I would have believed possible. And I think it's important to be professional, but not too slick. And that, I think, is the balance that has to be found. Of course, the trust was established in 1976, and in those days, I remember there was a great deal of skepticism and a sentiment of disbelief amongst quite a large number of people about the ideas that I was putting forward. And in particular about making grants of money to people who were in the sort of areas which I particularly wanted to get at, which was those who were most alienated and disadvantaged, who were in the kinds of places that others perhaps found difficulty in reaching. And this was why I felt very strongly about the importance of taking risks, that you had to take a risk in order to make sure that you were reaching the sort of people who normally weren't reached.
He became an early advocate for environmental conservation, sustainable agriculture, and organic farming, often speaking on issues years before they entered mainstream debate. Through the Duchy of Cornwall, he also took an increasingly active role in modernising the estate, promoting sustainable development and strengthening its financial performance.
Well, any heir to the throne always has a series of responsibilities, some of which are quite dull. I mean, going to functions, opening things, meeting people. Some are more exciting, going on international tours and things like that. And Charles got on with it because essentially every member of the royal family knew and knows that to get on with something like this is what you're there for. You're not there to be lionised all the time. You are a public servant, and public service is something that is drilled into them very, very young. And so Charles's attitude when he was Prince of Wales, a young man in his 20s, was simply, I'm expected to do this, I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it to the best of my abilities. And in fact, I think he took after his mother, who was always the supreme public servant.
By the early 2000s, Charles had become far more than the heir to the throne. He was using his unique position to shape ideas, champion charitable causes, and quietly develop the model of monarchy he hoped one day to inherit. One built on duty, accountability, and public service. Charles also endured years of intense public scrutiny over the breakdown of his marriage to Diana, Princess of Wales, culminating in divorce and the long, difficult path towards public acceptance of his relationship with Camilla.
The question of whether Charles loved Diana is a really tricky one, because we can't go that deeply into their personal lives. I mean, certainly his relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles was a much more important one and a much longer lasting one. So I think the difficulty is that while I'm sure he had affection for her, while I'm sure there was an understanding and I think a trust between the two of them, she was not the great love of his life, Camilla was. And I think that he knew that, Camilla knew that, and Diana knew that. So that was a situation that if he'd been allowed to marry Camilla in the first place, the world would have been a much happier place, but it wasn't to be.
Andrew's marriage to Sarah Ferguson also collapsed under relentless media attention, yet his public image recovered more quickly.
I think it was just very clear that Diana and Fergie were very different personalities. The most important thing as far as palace officials and the family were concerned was that Fergie was working to support the activities of the royal family. It was very much Fergie, very much loving the fact that she joined the royal family and that they were this charismatic couple that really struck a different kind of tone than Charles and Diana.
Sarah's got 600 of the 720 kids.
What? It's very, very much my day. I'm marrying Andrew, and that's all there is about it. It is so much my day, because I'm going to be with him, and I'm doing it for him. I'm not doing it for the rest of the world. I'm very sad not to be getting married in Dunbar Village Church, but I'm equally so delighted to be getting married in the Abbey. Anywhere would do, whether it's Gretna Green, anywhere. I'm quite happy because I'm marrying Andrew. That's all that matters.
For Charles, the collapse of his marriage would become the defining challenge of his life as heir to the throne. Every aspect of his private life was examined for all to see, his judgment questioned, and his future as king openly debated. It was a period that would fundamentally shape both his public image and his understanding of the monarchy's relationship with the British people. Unlike Charles and Diana, however, Andrew and Sarah maintained a remarkably close friendship after their marriage ended. They continued to raise their daughters together and remained a visible part of each other's lives long after their divorce. Their relationship stood in sharp contrast to the increasingly bitter and public breakdown unfolding between the Prince and Princess of Wales. Within the family, loyalties inevitably became complicated. Royal biographers have offered differing accounts of where those loyalties lay.
The state of the royal marriage. Mr. Morton, the palace said today that no third party is involved. Can that be right?
Ostensibly no, but given the fact that the Princess of Wales believes that Prince Charles's friendship with another woman, Camilla Parker Bowles, has cast a long shadow over that marriage, must be considered when you look at the failure of this 11-year union.
And Prince Charles?
Well, for his part, obviously it's a sad day, because he will have to soldier on, knowing that more revelations about his private life, his relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles, may well come out in the future.
You think that's a possibility, that there'll be more revelations about third parties, despite what the palace says?
The fact that the Camilla Gate tapes, the so-called Camilla Gate tapes, have not yet been published remains a sword of Damocles hanging over Prince Charles's head and could fatally damage his position.
Some have suggested Andrew sympathised with Diana's frustration at life within the royal family, while others argue his strongest allegiance remained with the institution and, above all, with his mother. There is little contemporary evidence that Andrew became directly involved in the conflict between Charles and Diana, and neither brother has spoken publicly about the period. Yet the divisions created by the so-called War of the Waleses affected every member of the family, exposing private tensions to an unprecedented public audience. For Charles, the experience left a lasting impression. He had witnessed how personal relationships could inflict lasting damage on the monarchy itself. Public confidence had been shaken, media scrutiny had intensified, and the institution had been forced to confront questions about its relevance, transparency, and ability to adapt. It was a lesson Charles would carry with him for decades. For much of the 1990s and early 2000s, Andrew remained a popular royal, often attracting attention for his military service rather than his personal life, unlike Charles. Behind the scenes, however, concerns were beginning to emerge. Andrew's growing network of wealthy international contacts attracted increasing scrutiny, and questions were occasionally raised about the boundaries between his official duties and his private associations. As the trade envoy, the role saw him travel extensively on behalf of the British government, promoting UK business interests overseas, supporting British exports, and helping to strengthen commercial relationships with foreign governments and investors. The position brought him into contact with world leaders, wealthy entrepreneurs, and influential business figures, reinforcing his reputation as a globe-trotting royal. Supporters praised his energy and international connections, arguing that his royal status opened doors for British companies. Critics, however, questioned whether some of the relationships he cultivated blurred the lines between official diplomacy, personal networking, and the privileges of royal status. Those concerns remained largely in the background until one name began to appear with increasing frequency: Jeffrey Epstein.
Epstein has been this kind of name and story that's been circling for years, and I don't think really it's had the cut through that certainly it now has. I don't think there was any sense of this, certainly I didn't have, of this individual who was such a prolific paedophile at the sort of centre of this network, this, exploitative sex trafficking network that drew in the rich and powerful abusing, young women. I had no sense of that. And so originally when that Epstein photo, it seemed like this is Andrew as making poor choices again.
Andrew first met the American financier in the late 1990s through Ghislaine Maxwell. Even after Epstein's conviction for sex offences in 2008, the Duke continued to associate with him, culminating in the now infamous 2010 meeting in New York, photographed as Andrew left Epstein's Manhattan townhouse. The images triggered immediate criticism and marked a significant turning point. Within months, Andrew stepped down as the UK's trade envoy amid growing pressure over his judgment and associations. For the first time, questions about his conduct were no longer confined to the gossip columns. They had become a problem for the institution itself. For Charles, who had spent years arguing that the monarchy's survival depended upon public trust, the implications were profound. The divide between the brothers was no longer simply one of personality or outlook. It was becoming a question of reputation, accountability, and the future direction of the crown. The greatest crisis in Prince Andrew's royal career was still to come. But by the beginning of the 2000s, the foundations had already begun to shift, setting both brothers on a collision course that neither could avoid. Questions that had lingered for years were now dominating newspaper front pages around the world. As Epstein's crimes came under renewed international scrutiny, attention increasingly turned to those who had remained within his circle. Among them was the former Duke of York. Andrew repeatedly denied any wrongdoing and strongly rejected the allegations made against him. But in November 2019, his decision to address the controversy in a BBC Newsnight interview proved to be one of the most consequential moments in modern royal history.
The subsequent allegations are what I would describe as surprising, shocking, and a distraction.
Newsnight had been looking to interview Andrew for some time, and originally Andrew, who was involved in this Pitch to the Palace initiative, which was where sort of young entrepreneurs would pitch ideas in a kind of Dragon's Den way and try and get funding and support. And he was looking to do an interview about, his Pitch to the Palace scheme to show, his good works and what he was doing. And Newsnight were very clear that, they weren't really interested in doing a puff piece for Andrew, but would want a kind of no holds barred, quite direct interview. There was a sense, certainly from Andrew, and we don't know really what his daughters thought about it, but that it would be a good thing. He made clear in the interview that this wasn't at the request of his mother and that she wasn't involved in it. But I think it speaks to his sense of arrogance, that he really believed he could manage this, that his narrative was absolutely going to shut all of this down.
It's hard to say when public support for Prince Andrew began to slip. I haven't looked back at the polling data, but I think from memory, over 5 years ago, or maybe at the time of the Emily Maitlis interview, when support for him would have started to crash.
And yet he was really puffed up and proud that he felt the interview had gone really well, when of course, you know, the BBC producers couldn't believe what had just happened. And so total arrogance and naivety. And I think if there needed to be a kind of absolute last straw sense that Andrew, you know, there really was no way back, I think that interview was it. I mean, it was disastrous. There have been many disastrous royal interviews, and that has to be one of the worst.
Instead of drawing a line under the scandal, the interview intensified it. His explanations were widely criticised, public confidence collapsed, and within days, Andrew announced that he was stepping back from public duties. It was an extraordinary moment. A senior royal, once considered among the most prominent members of the family, had effectively withdrawn from public life. Yet the crisis was far from over. In 2021, Virginia Giuffre brought a civil lawsuit against Andrew in the United States, alleging that she had been sexually assaulted when she was 17, after being trafficked by Jeffrey Epstein.
He knows exactly what he's done, and I hope he comes clean about it.
Andrew denied the allegations, and no criminal charges were brought against him. In February 2022, the case was settled out of court without an admission of liability. Even before the settlement, Queen Elizabeth II had taken the unprecedented decision to remove Andrew's honorary military appointments and royal patronages, confirming that he would defend the case as a private citizen rather than as a working member of the royal family.
It is a largely symbolic act, and legislation hasn't gone through to kind of formally change the line of succession, or indeed remove Andrew from being a Councillor of State, which basically means that he is one of the senior royals in terms of the line of succession. So in some ways it is symbolic, but of course along with that has gone this absolute abandonment of the royal family from Andrew, that he now has, you know, no public visibility, and the expectation that he really stays not in exile as it were abroad, and not imprisoned as such, but largely, you know, confined to this property in Norfolk, and in that sense in an exile of sorts.
The institution had drawn a line, but behind palace walls, another question remained unresolved. What would happen after the Queen?
Good evening. Buckingham Palace has announced the death of Queen Elizabeth II, the longest reigning monarch in British history.
So let me just now repeat that statement from the royal household, which we have received in the last few minutes. It reads, "The Queen died peacefully at Balmoral this afternoon. The King and the Queen Consort will remain at Balmoral this evening and will return to London tomorrow."
Her reign lasted for 70 years, from post-war austerity and the end of empire through the expansion of the Commonwealth. She helped preserve the institution of the monarchy during times of massive social change. At her coronation, the Queen repeated her pledge to serve her people and fulfilled it throughout her reign with a combination of skill and a sense of duty.
Well, Charles grieved in public, and I think there's that incident where he couldn't find a pen and he lost his temper. And this went viral, and it was very much seen as something that people were looking at and thinking, oh, he's got a bad temper. But actually, what I think it was the amount of stress and pressure that he must have been under. It's not at all surprising that he lost his temper, because you're not allowed to cry. That's the thing about the royal family. You're not allowed to weep, and you're not allowed to show these sort of emotions in public. And so his temper, I think, has been short because of the pressure that he's been under. I think it's impossible to speculate as to what his final words to his mother would have been or vice versa, but I would have said, knowing what we know about King Charles, that he would have said something along the lines of, I will carry on what you have started, I will make sure that you're proud of me and proud of your country. Because I think that ultimately that sense of duty is what he's inherited, and that sense of putting your country first, which the Queen prized herself on all her life, and I think you can see that's something that he would have done as well.
I mean, it's long been said that Andrew was the Queen's favourite, and certainly we saw even in her reign, particularly in the latter part, her absolutely deliberately siding herself with and therefore showing her support for Andrew, perhaps most notably after more Epstein revelations had come out and that he'd stepped back somewhat from a public role. She was pictured being accompanied by Andrew at Prince Philip's memorial service, and that was a very deliberate show of her support. They were pictured riding together. And of course, you know, allegedly the Queen paid from her own private income the settlement for Virginia Giuffre to basically withdraw or rescind her allegations, or at least not pursue them in a civil court.
Throughout her reign, Elizabeth II was widely seen as Andrew's strongest source of support. While she accepted the need to remove him from public duties, she continued to maintain a close personal relationship with her son. Charles, by contrast, was increasingly associated with a different approach. Although Buckingham Palace never commented on private discussions, royal biographers and palace correspondents have consistently reported that the Prince of Wales believed Andrew should never return to public life. Whether motivated by personal conviction, institutional necessity, or both, Charles was said to view the scandal as fundamentally incompatible with the future monarchy he hoped to build. Those accounts have never been officially confirmed. What is beyond dispute is that Charles had spent decades advocating for a smaller, more disciplined monarchy, one in which public trust would be its greatest asset. Andrew's continued presence presented an obvious challenge to that vision. Then, in September 2022, Queen Elizabeth II died, ending a reign that had lasted 70 years. For the first time, Charles no longer had to prepare for the future. He was now responsible for it. The difficult decisions that had once belonged to his mother now belonged to him alone. And almost immediately, one decision rose above all others. What place, if any, was there for Prince Andrew in the reign of King Charles III? One brother carried the weight of the crown. The other had become its greatest test.
That might be their hope, but it is difficult to see how this will play out for the royals when police are searching the former home of the King's brother on the Windsor estate.
The morning of the 19th of February 2026 began like any other birthday for Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. Instead, it became one of the most extraordinary days in modern royal history. Shortly after 10 a.m., Thames Valley Police confirmed that officers had arrested a man in his 60s from Norfolk on suspicion of misconduct in public office.
Misconduct in public office is a rather vague offence because at the moment it's an offence at common law, and so its definition is not laid down in any Act of Parliament, but only in case law established by the courts. And what the case law shows is that misconduct in public office is committed when someone so seriously neglects their duties or misconducts themselves that they abuse public trust.
So the arrest was about not the associations with Epstein, which is still being investigated, but actually about his activities in public office. So he was, of course, a trade envoy, and there's alleged links with China, passing on information, not being entirely transparent and accountable in that role. So he did step down from the role of trade envoy. He was forced to do that originally when the first rumours of his friendship with Epstein emerged. But I think there's questions about what his role was, what benefits, what privileges, what money he gained in that position. And it's that really is a failing of the institution in allowing these kind of appointments. Should a royal have that kind of role, have that kind of privilege and access, especially if what he's doing is not fully accounted for?
Although, in keeping with UK policing practice, the force did not initially identify the individual by name, it quickly became clear that the man in custody was Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, formerly Prince Andrew. Detectives simultaneously executed search warrants at properties in Norfolk and Berkshire as part of what they described as a live criminal investigation. The arrest followed weeks of mounting scrutiny after the publication of further material connected to Jeffrey Epstein and allegations relating to Andrew's time as the United Kingdom's Special Representative for International Trade and Investment. Investigators were examining whether confidential information had been improperly shared while Andrew held public office. At the time of his arrest, Andrew denied any wrongdoing, and police stressed that he had been arrested on suspicion of an offence rather than charged with one. For much of the day, Andrew remained in police custody while officers carried out interviews and continued searches of royal properties. Television cameras gathered outside Sandringham and Royal Lodge as rolling news coverage dominated headlines across Britain and around the world. It was an unprecedented spectacle. Never before in modern history had the brother of a reigning British monarch been arrested as part of a criminal investigation.
I think, the word unprecedented is bandied around a lot, but it's absolutely true that a senior royal has not been arrested for 350 years, since Charles I was arrested, subsequently tried and beheaded. This is really significant. I think there is questions about the accountability and transparency of the monarchy, and I think, the failure, in a sense, to move with the times and understand the responsibilities to the public that they have, and this sense that they could be exempt from public scrutiny and accountability. So I think that's a failing. The system that has these working royals that are expected to uphold the brand of monarchy, whilst at the same time having all kinds of access to the great and the good around the world, wealth, access, privilege. Again, you get someone like Andrew who is susceptible to, influence, who likes being courted, who likes the high life, then clearly there's vulnerability there. So I think there is things around the system, around the institution, but also failings clearly around Andrew.
Late that evening, police confirmed that Andrew had been released under investigation. No charges had been brought, but the inquiry remained active. Detectives emphasized that their investigation was continuing and urged restraint in public reporting while inquiries progressed. As extraordinary as the arrest itself was, the response from Buckingham Palace proved equally significant. Breaking with generations of royal convention, King Charles III issued a personal statement within hours of his brother's arrest. Describing the news as one he had learned with the deepest concern, the king pledged the royal family's full and wholehearted support and cooperation with the investigation before delivering a sentence that immediately dominated newspaper front pages around the world. The law must take its course. He concluded by saying it would be inappropriate to comment further while the investigation continued, and that he and the royal family would continue their public duties. The statement was remarkable, not simply because it acknowledged the arrest, but because of what it represented. For decades, the palace had sought to shield family crises behind a wall of silence. This time, the sovereign publicly aligned himself with the criminal justice process rather than with his younger brother. It was a striking demonstration of Charles's determination to place the institution above the individual and reinforce the message that no member of the royal family, however senior, stood apart from the rule of law.
Reputational damage is one possible sanction if there's been media exposure of wrongdoing, but senior royals are all subject to the law in exactly the same way as any other citizen. Members of the royal family undoubtedly lead privileged lives in terms of their material circumstances. They live in big houses and palaces. Some of them are supported through public funds because of the public duties they perform. But when it comes to equality before the courts, they are in exactly the same position as any other citizen. And if Prince Andrew is prosecuted in due course, he will receive a fair trial like anyone else, and it will be a jury that will decide whether or not he's guilty, and it will be a judge who will then pass sentence on him. And I expect both the judge and the jury to be completely uninfluenced by the fact that he's a member of the royal family.
Not my king! Down with the crown! Not my king! Down with the crown! Down with the crown! Not my king! Not my king! Andrew's the king! Andrew's the king! Andrew's the king! Andrew's the king! Charlie, Charlie, what did you know?
Good afternoon, Your Majesty. Do you have any reaction to the arrest of your brother, sir? Your Majesty, how are you feeling after your...
Andrew has remained excluded from public duties. There would be no return to royal work, no restoration of military appointments, and no attempt to rehabilitate his public role. Although he continued to appear alongside the royal family on private occasions, his place within the institution had fundamentally changed. The disagreements that followed over royal lodge, personal security and financial support quickly became public, offering a rare glimpse into what appeared to be a growing divide between the brothers. Buckingham Palace declined to comment on the private discussions, but reports of increasingly difficult negotiations fueled speculation that Charles was determined to complete a process that had begun years earlier, separating Prince Andrew from the public face of the monarchy. Whether those reports accurately reflected the private relationship between the brothers may never be known. Like so much within the House of Windsor, the most important conversations took place behind closed doors. There are no public letters, no televised arguments, and no definitive account of what passed between them. Instead, the story survives through careful observation, informed reporting, and the decisions that unfolded in public. And those decisions speak for themselves.
I think generally people want Andrew to face justice and be called to account to answer for himself. I think people think he obviously knew Epstein and had involvement and associations with what Epstein was doing. Whether that meant that he himself was doing illegal activity, that remains to be said. But I think on the very least, people think, why would he not testify what he knows?
We don't yet know whether the evidence from the Epstein files might lead to Andrew being prosecuted for trafficking for the purpose of sexual exploitation. That is a very serious charge. But simply from what has been disclosed so far, I'm not surprised that public opinion about Prince Andrew is very, very strongly negative. His public disapproval ratings are below 90%, and you don't get much lower than that.
And I think also people would say, probably Andrew's a wrong 'un, and if there is evidence and a case to be brought, it absolutely should be heard. The King has been really clear that the course of law should be followed, so it remains to be seen. I think people would absolutely like Andrew to be, to be in court, to face charges, but yeah, it very much depends on where the evidence is.
It's impossible to say at this stage exactly what Charles's sense of duty is, because we have not seen him as monarch long enough to really understand what kind of monarch he's going to be. I would expect that he would be following in his mother's footsteps. I would expect, from everything that we've seen of him as Prince of Wales, that his sense of duty is a strong sense of duty and an inherited sense of duty. But maybe he'll express it in different ways, because the Queen was somebody who never gave interviews, never gave any kind of public statements if she could avoid it, very much kept herself above such things. Charles has given many interviews and many public statements, and so we shall see. I mean, it's impossible to predict it with any degree of certainty, but I would suspect that he will try and be like his mother, but a more accessible 21st century version.
It is not simply about a family divided, but about the impossible choices that come with monarchy itself. A king is expected to be both sovereign and brother, guardian of an ancient institution, and head of a deeply imperfect family. History suggests those roles do not always sit comfortably together. Whether Charles believes he sacrificed his brother for the crown is something only he can answer. But history may conclude that, when faced with a choice between protecting the institution or protecting his family, the king made the only decision he believed the crown could survive. Behind every crown, there is conflict. Behind every royal family, there are feuds. And behind every reign lies a choice between loyalty and duty. For King Charles III, no choice has been more personal than the one involving his own brother.